France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Olaf Scholz say they're ready to pursue dialogue with Russia in order to prevent any military action. But speaking after holding talks in Berlin, President Macron said Russia will pay a high price if it attacks Ukraine. Macron echoed his US counterpart, President Biden's words, saying Europe and its allies are united on the issue of Ukraine. He says they're preparing a common response to any aggressive action from Moscow. Russia has repeatedly denied that it plans to invade Ukraine.
We both call very strongly for a de-escalation of tensions, and I want to say here how much Germany and France are united on this subject, whether in the discussions that we have within the framework of NATO, the European Union, within the OSCE, but also as the two European partners of the so-called Normandy format.
Well, let's cross now straight to Berlin and speak to reporter Kate Brady, who is tracking developments for us there. Good to see you this evening, Kate. To begin with, we know that these two have been putting on a united front, but at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. Is Germany now on France's page? Because previously it had been a little more reticent on a number of issues.
Absolutely, at least hearing a united front there, underlining what we've heard from other NATO allies in recent days as well. And there are some points where France and Germany are more in line with each other, even largely speaking when it comes to potential sanctions against Russia, should there indeed be a military intervention against Ukraine. And both France and Germany have even raised concerns about possible wider impacts of potential sanctions on EU countries as well, should there be any sanctions. Of course, just thinking back to 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea, just zooming in on the Franco-Russian commercial ties, they plummeted by about a third back then, of course, and it took a long, but there has been a steady but long recovery following the impact of those sanctions following the annexation. At the same time, of course, Germany has its own concerns, being a huge major importer of Russian gas as well. But of course, talking of sanctions, we have to mention that controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. That's something that Germany and France have very different opinions on. France, for a long time, has been a staunch critic of that pipeline that runs between Russia and Germany, that we should remind ourselves is not yet up and running, and as other NATO allies have said in recent days, could potentially be used as leverage towards Russia. That's what we were hearing from the US last week when the US Secretary of State was here in Berlin. But of course, one of the other key issues where the two countries differ is also on arms exports. France has already voiced its willingness to provide Ukraine with additional arms. Germany doing quite the opposite, effectively blocking arms exports to Kiev. So still some rather contentious issues that Macron and Scholz will be working their way through this evening.
Some contentious issues, Kate, but still at this stage we know that some fragile diplomacy is still on the table. We're expecting talks tomorrow between France, Germany, Ukraine and Russia. Can we hold out hope for any breakthroughs there?
There is certainly the sense of some very, very, I should add, cautious optimism here in Berlin, but we're not expecting any huge breakthroughs tomorrow. Just to remind ourselves, this Normandy format last convened back in 2019, so there's no massive hopes, but at the moment, the key issue, at least for Macron and Scholz and their two countries, is the fact that dialogue is continuing, and that's something that France and Germany and other NATO allies are keen to push on with right now to try and de-escalate the situation on the Ukraine-Russia border.
All right, Kate Brady in Berlin. Good to talk to you as ever. Thanks, Kate. Well, Fabrice Poitier from the International Institute of Strategic Studies told us that the biggest weapon that Europe has is unity.
I mean, there's the urgency shared all across Europe and the United States. And obviously, everybody is speculating as to what President Putin really has in his up his sleeve. But the bottom line is obviously that you have an unprecedented level of force deployment by Russian forces at the Ukraine border. And therefore, that requires to show both unity, but also a range of responses that could be deployed if the Russians were to cross certain lines.
It's interesting that you just said there that this necessitates of course, united response. But we also know that different members have different stakes in this when we talk about France and Germany, for example. So if push comes to shove on this and Russia does invade Ukraine, will they be in agreement in terms of how to react militarily?
That I cannot speculate, but what is clear is that unity is our best weapon. And this is why the EU-US sanctions that have been implemented and held since 2014 have been actually pretty successful in showing to the Russians that we are walking in one step. However, I think what would be extremely powerful is not that President Macron goes to Berlin, but that he goes from Berlin to Moscow with Chancellor Scholz. I think that will send a very strong message that both France and Germany, and by extent, the whole of NATO is united in speaking with one voice to the Russians.